The year pressed down like the relentless Dakota sun, 1878. The territory itself was a canvas of stark, breathtaking beauty, endless skies mirroring the unforgiving earth below, vast prairies shimmering under heat or buried beneath snow. But beneath the beauty lay realities far harsher, realities that could break a man, or worse, force him to break his own soul. Have you ever truly contemplated the precariousness of a life, especially a woman's, when fate rests not in her hands, but in the ledgers of men driven by avarice and power? In an era where a signature scribbled on a debt note could bind tighter than iron shackles, one rancher's desperate gamble against nature and finance set the stage for a collision of worlds, worlds seemingly destined to remain forever apart, separated by culture, prejudice, and the invisible lines drawn across the land. Imagine Elizabeth Hayes, trembling not from the chill prairie wind, but from the profound humiliation of standing upon an auction block. Not a block for cattle or chattel in some distant market, but one her own father, Thomas Hayes, had been coerced into erecting on the very land soaked with generations of their sweat and struggle. His crushing debts pressed down on her, a tangible weight heavier even than the stifling societal constraints that had dictated the course of her young life. As the gazes of powerful men appraised her, no one, least of all Elizabeth herself, could have anticipated the silent, watchful figure, concealed in the periphery, a shadow against the flickering lanterns. No one foresaw how the arrival of a Lakota warrior named Swift River, a man navigating the treacherous currents between two hostile worlds, would irrevocably alter the destiny of everyone present amidst the sprawling plains where survival was. The battle fought daily by settler and native alike. Before we return to that pivotal, degrading moment under the indifferent stars, perhaps take a moment. Where are you joining this story from? It's a constant source of wonder how these tales of the frontier of human struggle and resilience can resonate across time and distance, touching hearts in corners of the world unimaginable in 1878. And if this story is already beginning to whisper to your spirit, if you feel the magnetic pull of this unforgiving yet profoundly human landscape, consider hitting that subscribe button. The journey we embark upon now is one etched in courage, born of desperation, sacrifice offered with trembling hands, and the astonishing ways hope, like the hardiest prairie flower, can force its way through the most arid, unpromising soil. The Dakota sky, an immense piercing blue, stretched endlessly above the Hayes ranch. It felt less like a promise and more like a cruel mockery to Thomas Hayes, as he stood, shoulders slumped, the foreclosure notice clutched tight in his weathered, calloused hand. The paper felt brittle, final. 6 consecutive years the land had thirsted. 6 years the rains had held back, turning his once thriving cattle ranch, a legacy passed down through 3 generations, into a parched, dust-choked shadow of its former self. The creeks ran low, the grass withered brown, and the cattle grew thin, their ribs stark against their hides. Now the bank in Clearwater, impersonal and implacable, had called in his loan. 30 days, an impossible deadline to conjure $5,000, a fortune in this drought-stricken land, or lose everything, not just the house, the barn, the remaining herd, but the very soul of his family, embedded in the soil itself. Inside the modest but sturdy log house, the air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and worry, Elizabeth Hayes stood by the small kitchen window. She watched her father, his familiar silhouette against the vast, indifferent landscape, seeming smaller, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. At 22, she possessed a quiet strength that belied her gentle features. Her chestnut, hair often escaping its pins in wisps around a face both resolute and kind, framed eyes that had seen too much hardship too soon. Since her mother's passing 5 years prior, a loss that still felt like a raw wound, Elizabeth had become the linchpin of their fractured family, managing the household, stretching dwindling supplies, and offering silent support with steady hands and a determination forged in loss and responsibility. "Father?" she called softly, her voice carrying clearly on the dry air as she stepped onto the warped planks of the porch. "Dinner's ready. Managed to make stew from the last of the smoked rabbit." Thomas turned, startled, hastily folding the aise, dreaded notice and tucking it deep into his worn shirt pocket, as if hiding it could negate its existence. "Be right there, Lizzie," he managed, attempting a smile that didn't reach his weary eyes. But Elizabeth wasn't fooled. She had seen the stiff-backed men from the bank ride away earlier that day, their crisp suits, polished boots, and air of detached authority had seemed obscenely out of place amidst the swirling dust and palpable struggle of the ranch. Their presence had left a cold dread in its wake. "How bad is it this time, Father?" she asked, her voice steady, though a familiar coil of fear tightened in her stomach. She braced herself. For a fleeting moment, Thomas considered weaving another comforting lie, another hollow promise that the rains would come next season, that their luck would turn. But the cumulative weight of years spent suppressing the grim truth of shielding Elizabeth from the full extent of their precariousness had finally worn him down. He met her gaze, his own reflecting a bone-deep exhaustion. "We have 30 days, he admitted, his voice raspy, tasting like the dust that coated everything. $5,000, Lizzie, or we lose it all, everything." Elizabeth absorbed the devastating sum quietly. Her mind, practical and quick, immediately began a frantic inventory, the value of their remaining drought-thinned cattle, the few precious pieces of her mother's jewelry tucked away in a wooden box, pieces she'd sworn never to part with, the old wagon, the spare tools, even selling every last marketable possession, stripping the ranch bare. They couldn't possibly bridge that chasm of debt. The number hung in the air between them, monumental, insurmountable. "We'll find a way," she said finally, the words feeling inadequate, spoken more to shore up her father's crumbling spirit than from any tangible conviction. "We always have." Thomas didn't answer. He just turned and walked slowly towards the house, his silence a heavy shroud that frightened Elizabeth more than any outpouring of despair could have. You see, this Dakota land, it tested a soul in ways unique and profound. It offered sunrises that bled colors across the horizon, like divine paintings, and skies so vast they could swallow you whole. But it demanded payment, in sweat that evaporated instantly in the dry heat, in tears shed in lonely corners, and, sometimes heartbreakingly, in the forfeiture of dreams nurtured over lifetimes. 1878. 6 years of drought. Imagine the relentless, soul-crushing grind, the cracked earth pleading for moisture, the wells running sluggishly, then dry, hope dwindling with each cloud that drifted past, teasingly empty. Dust wasn't just on surfaces, it was an entity, seeping into the grain of the wood, clinging to clothes, coating the tongue, settling deep within the spirit like a fine, gritty sediment of despair. This was Thomas Hayes's burden. A rugged man, his lifeblood intertwined with this very soil, just as his fathers and grandfathers had been. He knew every dip and rise, every stubborn patch of prairie grass. But love, however deep, couldn't conjure rain or appease the cold. Arithmetic of the bank's ledgers. The Hayes Ranch, once a beacon of resilience, a testament to hard work, was fading. Neighbors, broken by the relentless drought, had already packed their meager belongings onto wagons, leaving behind hollow-eyed houses and the ghosts of failed dreams, chasing rumors of greener pastures elsewhere. But for the Hayes family, there was nowhere else. This land, this struggle, was all they knew, all they had. The fear etched on Thomas's brow wasn't just about losing a home, it was the terrifying prospect of losing his heritage, his connection to the past, his family's very identity. And Elizabeth, Lizzie. Her gentle demeanor was a veil over a core of tempered steel. Since her mother's death, she hadn't merely kept house. She'd become her father's shadow, his confidant, his right hand in the desperate fight to keep the ranch afloat. She understood the grim figures in the ledger books, could calculate dwindling feed reserves, and worked alongside the few remaining ranch hands, her hands as capable tending livestock or mending fences as they were kneading dough. She felt the suffocating weight on her father, the invisible vice tightening around their lives, and she made quiet sacrifices, selling a cherished silver locket, her mother's last birthday gift, for a few precious sacks of feed, foregoing a new dress to buy medicine for her father's persistent cough. Small acts of love, understood only by hearts willing to break a little for those they cherish. Perhaps the first lesson here is about that hidden reservoir of strength within us, tapped only when adversity pushes us to the brink. Elizabeth was living proof, but cruelty often wears a mask of opportunity. In the nearby burgeoning town of Clearwater, a hub of commerce and ambition, lived a man named Marshall Wilson Crawford. Not a lawman in the traditional sense, but the town's most powerful banker and landowner, a man whose wealth insulated him from the drought's bite. Crawford possessed a shrewd eye for value, not in glittering gold, but in something far more fundamental in this parched territory: water. He knew intimately about the small, unassuming creek that meandered through the eastern section of the Hayes Ranch. It wasn't a mighty river, but it was reliable, fed by a stubborn spring, the only consistent water source for miles. Acquiring. The Hayes place meant controlling the region's lifeblood, granting him leverage over every other rancher for miles around. The 3 generations of Hayes history, the sweat equity poured into the recalcitrant soil, these meant nothing to Crawford. The ranch was simply a strategic asset, a prize to be seized, and the key to that prize, he soon decided, was Elizabeth herself. He'd noted her striking blend of resilience and refinement on previous visits to the bank with her father. An unmarried, woman of good standing, desperate, useful. Meanwhile, not far distant, unseen by most settlers, another community fought its own desperate battle for survival. The Lakota Sioux, the original stewards of these plains for generations beyond counting, were squeezed by the same relentless drought, by devastating diseases introduced by white expansion, and by increasingly harsh government policies determined to confine them to shrinking reservations, severing their ancient ties to the land. Among them moved a man named Tashunka Wakinyan, Swift River. He was a figure of intriguing complexity, born of a Lakota mother and a white trader father, fluent in the languages and customs of both worlds. This made him a natural bridge, but also placed him in a difficult, often isolating position. He moved between the reservation and the white settlements, trading furs and acting as an occasional uneasy intermediary. He saw the quiet suffering of his people, the slow erosion of their way of life, and he keenly felt the simmering injustice spreading like a poison across the plains. 3 distinct orbits: the struggling white rancher teetering on ruin, the calculating, ruthless banker poised to exploit that weakness, and the Lakota warrior trying to navigate the treacherous path of protecting his people in a world rapidly changing around them. Their paths, seemingly parallel and destined never to cross, were about to collide with the force of a prairie thunderstorm. Time, indifferent to human desperation, slipped away like sand through Thomas Hayes's fingers. The 30 days dwindled, relentlessly. Every potential avenue of help proved a dead end. Neighbors struggling themselves offered sympathetic headshakes but empty pockets. Familiar traders in Clearwater offered insultingly low prices for his remaining cattle, sensing his desperation like sharks smelling blood. Only one option remained, one he dreaded, one that felt like swallowing shards of glass, confronting Marshall Crawford directly at his bank, hat in hand, to plead for an extension, perhaps offer the eastern pasture outright. He didn't know, couldn't fathom that this meeting wouldn't be about land or cattle, but would place a burden upon his beloved daughter, far heavier, far more degrading than the crushing $5,000 debt. Sometimes life corners us, forcing pride to kneel before the fragile altar of hope. Thomas Hayes, a man whose posture had always mirrored his unwavering self-respect, now had to walk into the lion's den, the opulent facade of the Clearwater Bank, clinging to a sliver of a chance to negotiate salvation for his family. The bank was an alien world. Polished marble floors gleamed under the light of expensive gas lanterns, reflecting distorted images of the dusty, worn rancher standing hesitantly within. The air hung thick with the cloying scent of polished mahogany, expensive, cigars and money, a stark, cruel contrast to the honest smells of earth, sweat and livestock that clung to Thomas's clothes. It wasn't just a building, it was a declaration of power, a physical manifestation of the vast gulf separating lender from borrower. Marshal Crawford received Thomas not in his public office, but in a private, richly furnished study, magnifying the intimidation. He didn't offer sympathy, only the condescending air of a man holding all the cards, enjoying the supplicant's discomfort. Thomas, swallowing his pride, laid out his desperate proposal, selling the eastern pasture, the section with the vital creek, acknowledging its strategic value, hoping Crawford might see it as sufficient collateral, perhaps even offer a fair price exceeding the debt. He spoke haltingly of the 3 generations of Hayes who had poured their lives into the land, of its meaning beyond mere dollars and cents, his voice thick with emotion. Crawford merely smirked, leaning back in his plush leather chair, steepling his fingers. He waved a dismissive hand adorned with a heavy gold ring. "That parcel, Hayes? Generously speaking, it might cover half your debt in a normal year, in this drought." He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Hardly worth the ink on, the deed transfer." His eyes, however, held an unnerving, predatory gleam when the creek was mentioned. He knew its true value precisely. The floor seemed to drop away beneath Thomas's worn boots. He had braced himself for hard bargaining, perhaps refusal of an extension, but not this contemptuous dismissal of his only real asset. "Then what do you propose, Marshal?" he asked, his voice faltering, hope evaporating like morning dew. Surely there must be some arrangement. More time?" And then Crawford unveiled his true currency. Not land, not cattle, but flesh and blood. "Your daughter, Elizabeth," he said slowly, deliberately, savoring each word like a fine wine. His gaze sharpened, holding Thomas pinned like an insect. "She's of age, unmarried, I believe. A handsome girl, well-bred, seems capable. It happens I find myself considering remarriage." The silence in the opulent room grew thick, suffocating. Thomas surged to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the polished floor, the sound echoing in the sudden stillness. Are you suggesting I sell you my daughter?" His voice trembled, a low growl of disbelief, rage, and profound revulsion churning within him. "Tut, tut, Hayes, such crude language," Crawford corrected, his voice smooth as oiled leather but laced with cold venom. "Think of it as a mutually beneficial union, a marriage. Elizabeth would want for nothing, a life of comfort, security. In return," he paused, letting the implication hang heavy, "your troublesome debt would simply disappear, wiped clean. You keep the ranch, your legacy intact. A perfect solution. Wouldn't you agree?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes like chips of ice. "Or you have," he glanced at a pocket watch, "precisely 23 days left to find $5,000. The choice, my dear Hayes, is entirely yours." At that very hour, back in Clearwater's dusty main street, fate played a cruel hand. Elizabeth, having ridden into town for essential supplies they could barely afford, lingered near the general store, waiting for her small order. She inadvertently overheard snippets of hushed conversation between two townswomen, their voices low but carrying on the still air. They spoke of Marshal Crawford, of his first wife, a frail young woman from back east, who had died suddenly, mysteriously, less than a year into their marriage. Whispers of illness, yes, but also darker undertones, of isolation, of a controlling husband, of a death perhaps too convenient. The fragmented rumors struck Elizabeth like icy pellets, planting a vague yet deeply unsettling fear about the powerful man her father was, at that very moment, forced to deal with. When Thomas returned to the ranch hours later, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows, his face was a grey mask of internal conflict, shame warring with despair. He didn't need to utter a word. Elizabeth, seeing the utter defeat in his posture, the haunted look in his eyes, knew instantly that something far worse than foreclosure had transpired. He slumped into his usual chair by the cold hearth, unable to meet her gaze. And when he finally recounted Crawford's monstrous proposal, his voice barely a whisper, Elizabeth felt the solid ground beneath her feet tilt and sway. Silence descended upon the small log house, heavier and more suffocating than the drought-ridden air pressing in from outside. The only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart. What path lay before her? Marry a man more than twice her age, a man whose calculated gaze she'd encountered briefly at the bank and instinctively recoiled from, a man whose name was now linked in her mind to whispers of a dead wife and unspoken darkness. The thought made her skin crawl, a visceral revulsion tightening her chest, or stand by and watch her father, broken and defeated, lose everything. See 3 generations of relentless toil, sacrifice and love turn to dust under the auctioneers. Hammer? See her family, what little remained of it, cast out onto the unforgiving plains with nothing? It was an agonizing conflict, tearing at a young soul already burdened beyond her years. She thought of her mother, of the promise whispered at her bedside to always care for father, to protect their home, their legacy. She thought of the 2 loyal ranch hands who still remained, men with families of their own, who depended on the meager wages the ranch provided. Her personal happiness felt like a feather weighed against the crushing boulder of responsibility. Here lies another lesson, perhaps the most painful. Sometimes, love doesn't ask for grand, noble gestures performed on sunlit stages. Sometimes it demands grim, heart-wrenching choices in shadowed corners, forcing you to weigh your own future, your own well-being, against the survival, the very existence of those you hold most dear. Sacrifice, stripped bare of romance, is often a bitter transaction made with gritted teeth and a breaking heart. The following dawn broke grey and uncertain. Elizabeth hadn't slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed, shadowed with exhaustion and unshed tears, but when she spoke to her father, her voice was surprisingly steady, imbued with a chilling resolve that mirrored her mother's stoicism in hardship. "I'll do it, father." She didn't look at him, fixing her gaze on some indeterminate point across the room, as if staring directly into the bleak future she was forcing herself to accept. For mother. For you. For this home. Thomas started to protest, a strangled cry rising in his throat. He wanted to rage, to scream that he'd rather face ruin, rather starve than barter his daughter's life. But he saw the unshakable determination etched onto Lizzie's pale face, a reflection of the same iron will her mother possessed. He recognized with a fresh wave of despair that the decision, however abhorrent, had been made. His shoulders sagged, under the weight of his own perceived failure as a father, as a protector, and so with heavy hearts and a profound sense of dread, they prepared for the journey back to Clearwater. not for a joyous betrothal celebration, but to attend an event they both knew was a grotesque charade, a public spectacle designed to mask a bitter, coercive transaction. Thomas, clinging to a last shred of dignity, managed to negotiate with Crawford's clerk for what he thought would be a formal engagement announcement dinner, rather than an immediate, hasty wedding. A small concession, a feeble attempt to maintain appearances. But both he and Elizabeth understood the grim reality. Once the announcement was made before the town's influential figures, her fate would be irrevocably sealed. They could not possibly imagine the depths of Crawford's cruelty, the public stage he had meticulously prepared, where Elizabeth's dignity was not merely to be compromised, but utterly savaged for sport. Cruelty sometimes isn't wielded with whips or chains. It manifests in the calculated stripping away of a person's dignity, turning their vulnerability into a spectacle, their pain into perverse entertainment for a crowd thirsty for power dynamics. That evening, the Clearwater Town Hall, normally a place of mundane civic duty, was transformed. It wasn't honoring law or community, it was the setting for a meticulously orchestrated, humiliating charade, directed solely by Marshal Wilson Crawford. For his own gratification and the assertion of his dominance. He had billed it as an engagement announcement dinner. Yet the moment Elizabeth stepped through the doors clutching her father's arm, a chilling premonition washed over her. The atmosphere felt charged, wrong. The assembled guests, the region's wealthiest ranchers, merchants, and influential figures, men whose fortunes were often intertwined with Crawford's bank. Their gazes weren't merely admiring of a presentable young woman. They were assessing, calculating, the looks men gave prize livestock or property about to change hands. The forced opulence surrounding them, glittering crystal chandeliers dripping wax onto overloaded banquet tables, groaning under the weight of delicacies imported from the East, food untouched by the drought ravaging the land outside, felt garish, highlighting the inherent cheapness, the transactional core of the situation she was being forced to endure. Then Elizabeth's vague unease solidified into sickening horror. Crawford, beaming with false magnanimity, didn't lead her to a seat of honor. Instead, he guided her firmly towards a small, slightly raised platform at one end of the hall. A platform disturbingly, undeniably reminiscent of the slave auction. Blocks she'd only read about, or the stands used for selling cattle at market. Her breath hitched. Her father stiffened beside her, his hand tightening on her arm, but two burly men subtly employed by Crawford materialized, blocking any potential intervention from Thomas. Crawford stepped onto the platform beside her, raising his hands for silence. His voice, amplified by the expectant hush, boomed through the suddenly quiet room. He spoke of community spirit, of his own supposed generosity in extending a helping hand to the struggling Hayes family. He then proceeded to laud Elizabeth, not as a future wife but as a commodity. He praised her beauty, a fine figure, her propriety, well-mannered stock, her proven household management skills, doubtless efficient in overseeing domestic affairs. The sickening cadence of a huckster hawking a prized broodmare. Elizabeth stood frozen, a statue carved from ice, her face carefully schooled into a mask of blank indifference, desperately concealing the tempest of shame, fury, and terror raging within. Burning humiliation washed over her in waves, so intense it felt physical, like flames licking at her skin. She wanted to scream, to flee, to claw her way out of this nightmare. But her feet felt nailed to the rough wooden planks. Her only anchor to reality, to sanity, was the fierce clenching of her hands hidden within the folds of the expensive emerald silk dress Crawford had insisted she wear, a dress that now felt like sackcloth. Her fingernails dug mercilessly into her palms, the sharp, grounding sting of physical pain a desperate tool to keep her from collapsing, from shattering under the weight of hundreds of scrutinizing, predatory eyes. "However," Crawford continued, his voice shifting, adopting a tone of mock fairness, a performance for the crowd, "in the spirit of ensuring the absolute best future for our dear Miss Hayes here, and recognizing the interest her considerable assets might generate," he gestured towards Elizabeth with a proprietary air, "I've decided, in an act of perhaps foolish sentimentality, to entertain other offers. After all," his smile widened reptilian, "she deserves the finest possible match this territory can provide." A stunned silence gripped the hall, thick and incredulous, before erupting into a cacophony of shocked whispers, nervous laughter, and excited murmurs. Crawford had achieved his perverse goal, not merely acquiring Elizabeth, but transforming the coercive arrangement into a public spectacle of his power, a demonstration that he could not only take what he wanted, but could turn the very act into a game where others vied for his leavings, proving he could outbid anyone, control everything, even human destiny. "The bidding," he announced, his voice cutting through the rising noise like a whip crack, "will commence at $5,000, the precise sum, as many of you know, owed by the Hayes estate to my bank. A tidy sum to clear their slate and secure such a promising companion. Do I hear a higher offer for this exceptional young woman?" The sheer audacity, the monstrousness of it, hung in the air. A civilized gathering. This was barbarism draped in silk and chandeliers. Yet after a moment's hesitation, fueled by whiskey, ambition, or perhaps a genuine, if debased, desire for the striking woman on the block, a few men began to call out bids. Some perhaps saw a twisted opportunity for a wife and connection to Crawford's power. Others likely were merely playing along, eager to curry favor with the marshal. The price climbed, $5,500, $6,000. Each number spoken felt like a physical blow to Elizabeth, a fresh wave of degradation. Each bid was a dagger twisting in Thomas Hayes's heart, his face contorted in helpless rage, as Crawford's men held him fast, preventing him from intervening, forcing him to witness his daughter's ultimate humiliation. Crawford himself playing the part of the benevolent but determined suitor, theatrically bid $8,000, silencing most of the lesser players. He let the figure hang in the air, scanning the hall with a triumphant, possessive smirk. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your spirited participation, but it seems clear where Miss Hayes's best interests lie, unless there is any final serious offer." But just as he was about to declare the sordid affair concluded, the unexpected detonated. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall burst open with a resounding crack. Framed in the doorway stood a figure whose presence instantly commanded the attention of every person in the room. Tall, imposing, radiating an aura of quiet confidence and coiled strength. It was Swift River, but not the subdued trader known as James Blackhawk, whom some in Clearwater occasionally dealt with. Tonight he wore the traditional attire of a Lakota warrior, fringed buckskin leggings, a beaded vest over a simple shirt, eagle feathers woven into his long, dark braids. His entrance wasn't merely an interruption, it was a thunderclap, stunning the room into a shocked absolute silence. Women gasped audibly, shrinking back. Men instinctively shifted, hands moving towards concealed weapons, suspicion and ingrained fear flaring in their eyes. Crawford's face contorted, flushing a dangerous shade of purple. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" he bellowed, his voice tight with fury and disbelief. "Guards, remove this savage at once." But Swift River paid him no heed. He strode forward, his moccasined feet silent on the polished floor, his movements fluid and deliberate. His deep dark eyes, intense and unwavering, bypassed the sputtering marshal entirely, fixing solely on Elizabeth, standing pale and trembling on the platform. He saw not the commodity Crawford presented, but the fierce pride struggling beneath the terror, the spirit refusing to break. And then he spoke. His voice, though low and steady, carried the unmistakable resonance of natural authority, cutting through the tense silence like a honed blade. $10,000. The words dropped into the stillness like stones into a deep well. $10,000. Double the Hayes' crushing debt, an astronomical sum. The entire assembly seemed to cease breathing collectively. Crawford sputtered, momentarily speechless. This is a private gathering, a respectable affair amongst citizens. Your kind, he spat, venom returning, has no place here, Black Hawk. Or whatever heathen name you use. Only then did Swift River turn his piercing gaze towards Crawford, meeting the banker's fury with glacial calm. I see nothing respectable, he stated, his voice like ice shards, in men who trade human beings like horses at market. He reached into a sturdy leather pouch slung at his side, withdrew a smaller, heavy deerskin bag, and with a deliberate motion, tossed it onto a nearby banquet table laden with untouched food. The bag landed with a solid thud, bursting open upon impact. A cascade of shimmering, irregular shapes spilled across the white linen tablecloth, not coins, but raw gold, nuggets gleaming dully under the chandelier light, the tangible weight of wealth, primal and undeniable. $10,000, Swift River repeated, his voice unwavering, each syllable precise. In gold. He then turned his gaze, softened fractionally, towards the stunned Thomas Hayes. Double your debt, Mr. Hayes, unless you prefer your daughter belong to a man who speaks of honor but orchestrates this. His gesture encompassed the platform, the gawking crowd, the entire sordid spectacle. Crawford, livid, practically choking on his rage, began to bluster again. This is preposterous, an absurdity. No court, no decent man will permit a white woman, a lady, to be claimed by he searched for the most demeaning term, by someone offering fair value in an open bid. Swift River interrupted smoothly, his very calmness highlighting Crawford's apoplectic fury. I was under the impression, his voice dripped with barely concealed contempt, turning the banker's own premise against him. That was precisely the point of this auction. Escaping one nightmare doesn't guarantee an immediate dawn. Sometimes it merely plunges you into a disorienting twilight, where the shadows of old dangers haven't fully retreated and new, uncertain threats loom on the horizon. As Elizabeth, fair still trembling Thomas, and the enigmatic Swift River rode away from the garish lights and lingering stench of humiliation in Clearwater, they carried more than just the immediate relief of escape. They carried the heavy weight of an uncertain future, a cascade of unanswered questions, and the palpable tension of three disparate lives suddenly, violently intertwined. The silence on the ride back to the Hayes Ranch was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic hoofbeats and the dry whisper of the night wind across the prairie. Gratitude warred with confusion in Thomas Hayes's mind. He owed this Lakota warrior an immense, unthinkable debt, yet the man remained an enigma. Elizabeth, wrapped in a borrowed blanket Swift River had silently offered, felt a confusing mix of profound relief, lingering shame from the ordeal, and a burgeoning curiosity about their rescuer. Why had he done it? $10,000 in raw gold was a staggering sum, far exceeding the plausible earnings of a simple fur trader known as James Blackhawk. What was his true story? What were his motives? We don't know how to thank you, Mr. Blackhawk, Thomas finally stammered, the words clumsy, inadequate, his mind still reeling from the whiplash of the evening's events. That gold, my people call me Tashunka Wakinyan. Swift River, the warrior interrupted quietly, his voice retaining its deep calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil of the preceding hours. And the debt, Hayes. Consider it repayment. Repayment? Elizabeth asked, her voice clearer now, turning in her saddle to look directly at him for the first time since leaving the town hall. His profile was strong, stoic in the moonlight. Repayment for what? And then Swift River began to unravel the tangled threads of Crawford's avarice. He spoke not of impulsive rescue, but of calculated observation. He explained that he, through his dealings as Black Hawk, had overheard whispers, pieced together fragments of Crawford's ambition. Elizabeth, he explained, was merely the leverage, the means to an end. Crawford's true obsession was the water, the lifeblood of the drought-stricken territory. Complete control of the region's water sources was his ultimate goal, a power more absolute than mere money. The modest but reliable creek flowing through the eastern section of the Hayes land was the final, crucial piece in his strategy to dominate the surrounding ranches. "He coveted your daughter, yes?" Swift River clarified, his gaze meeting Elizabeth's briefly in the darkness, acknowledging the personal horror without dwelling on it. "But primarily as a tool. By forcing a marriage, he believed he could easily pressure your father," he nodded towards Thomas, "into signing over the rest of the land, especially the water rights, or failing that, simply wait, knowing the debt would eventually crush you, allowing him to seize it all through foreclosure anyway. The auction was a cruel display of power, meant to break you both publicly before sealing his claim." Swift River's explanation landed like cold, hard stones of truth. It didn't lessen the personal violation Elizabeth felt, but it illuminated the calculated ruthlessness behind it. Their outrage at Crawford solidified, mingled now with a dawning understanding of the Lakota warrior. He wasn't just a rescuer, he was a strategist, possessing a keen insight into the dark machinations of the white man's world, likely gleaned from his unique position straddling both cultures. But the story didn't end with the rescue. Swift River then revealed the depth of his foresight, the true nature of his intervention. From another pouch, he produced a carefully prepared document, a formal bill of sale, drafted according to territorial law. It detailed the transfer of ownership for the eastern parcel of the Hayes Ranch, the very section containing the precious creek, listing the buyer as James Blackhawk for the precise sum of $10,000 in gold. The sum he had just dramatically paid. "The gold was not a gift, Mr. Hayes," Swift River explained calmly, handing the document to the astonished rancher. "It was payment for the land. That parcel, legally registered under my name according to your laws, now serves as a buffer. Crawford cannot easily seize it or dam the creek to choke your ranch. And," his voice held a deeper resonance now, "it also ensures a safe passage and a vital water source for my people when they must travel near these lands." It was a masterstroke, an act of seeming impulsive chivalry transformed into a shrewd, strategic investment protecting both their interests, the Hayes family's survival and the Lakota's access to essential resources. An informal, uneasy alliance, born of desperation and mutual opposition to a common enemy, began to take shape. In the vast darkness of the Dakota night, however, Thomas still hesitated, holding the document as if it might burn him. He was a man of his time, raised in an era where prejudice against Native Americans was deeply ingrained, woven into the fabric of settler society. Gratitude warred fiercely with suspicion, shaking hands, entering into a legal agreement, sharing vital resources with Indians. It felt alien, fraught with perceived risks drummed into him since childhood. Elizabeth, however, with her more open mind and pragmatic grasp of their dire situation, saw the undeniable logic, the necessity, perhaps even the inherent fairness in Swift River's proposal. She sensed the integrity beneath his stoic exterior. In that moment, she became the fragile, essential bridge between her father's reluctant gratitude, tangled with ingrained prejudice, and the warrior's bold, unconventional offer of partnership. Here, perhaps lies a lesson about the difficult birth of trust across divides. Sometimes, those whom society labels other, even enemy, can emerge as the most unexpected and steadfast allies when stripped bare by circumstance. But building that bridge requires the courage to peer beyond the fog of prejudice, the willingness to take a tentative step onto uncertain ground, trusting an outstretched hand even when history dictates otherwise. Meanwhile, back in the lamplit rooms of Clearwater, Marshal Crawford was far from idle. The public humiliation, the thwarting of his meticulously laid plans, the sheer audacity of Swift River's intervention, it left him seething, choking on a toxic brew of fury and wounded pride. His desire for the Hayes Ranch and its water was now eclipsed by a burning need for revenge. Revenge against the Lakota warrior who had defied him, and revenge against the Hayes family for daring to escape his clutches, and, in doing so, exposing his methods. Almost immediately, fueled by Crawford's influence, insidious rumors began to slither through Clearwater like venomous snakes. Swift River was a thief, the gold ill-gotten. The Hayes family were colluding with savages, betraying their own kind. Crawford began subtly laying snares, instructing merchants to deny the Hayes credit, warning teamsters against hauling their goods, seeking to isolate them, to slowly strangle them economically and socially. As the first faint streaks of dawn painted the immense Dakota horizon with hues of pink and gray, Elizabeth and Thomas returned to a ranch that felt both saved and more imperiled than ever. The immediate threat of the debt and the forced marriage was lifted, a crushing weight removed, but they knew with chilling certainty that the real fight had only just begun. They had stumbled into a fragile, unspoken alliance with a man they knew virtually nothing about, beyond the courage, intelligence, and mystery he embodied. And in doing so, they had made a sworn implacable enemy of the most powerful and ruthless man in the region. Crawford's malice lurked like a shadow just beyond the firelight. Swift River's presence, though currently a shield, also brought new complexities, new anxieties. Could this nascent alliance, forged in crisis, possibly withstand the inevitable storm Crawford would unleash? Could they truly learn to trust each other across the vast cultural chasm that separated their worlds? These questions hung heavy and unanswered in the cold morning air as they faced a new, uncertain reality, where the lines between friend and foe, safety and peril, were more blurred and treacherous than ever before. There's an old saying, perhaps, born on plains like these: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. In the crucible of the Dakota Territory, survival often hinged on that very principle. Following the terrifying night in Clearwater and the subsequent fragile agreement over the eastern pasture, a slow, cautious transformation began at the Hayes Ranch. It wasn't an overnight blossoming of warm friendship. The roots of prejudice and mistrust ran too deep for that, but rather the painstaking, tentative construction of bridges. Bridges built not of wood and stone, but of shared necessity, grudging respect, and the dawning realization of mutual interdependence. Swift River, acting with quiet authority, facilitated the integration. His people, initially camping near the creek on the land now legally his, didn't remain separate guests. Under his guidance, and with the eventual hesitant agreement of Thomas, persuaded largely by Elizabeth's quiet insistence and the stark reality of their isolation, they became partners. They brought knowledge honed over centuries of living intimately with this land, identifying deep hidden springs untouched by the surface drought, recognizing edible weeds the cattle could forage when pastures failed, interpreting the subtle language of the wind, the flight patterns of birds, to predict incoming storms with uncanny accuracy. These were lessons of survival no settler's almanac could teach, invaluable wisdom passed down through generations. One elder, known as Matawakua, chasing bear, showed Thomas how to read the stress lines in the cottonwood trees near the creek to gauge the water table's depth, a skill that proved more reliable than Thomas's dwindling well. In return, the Hayes Ranch offered what it possessed: access to tools the Lakota lacked, knowledge of basic crop irrigation adapted for the small creek flow, techniques for building sturdier winter shelters and fences using milled lumber, and, crucially, formalized reliable access to the water from the eastern pasture Swift River now controlled. Men from both sides, white ranch hands who weeks earlier might have only seen savages, and Lakota warriors who viewed settlers with deep, justified suspicion, now found themselves laboring side by side under the same unforgiving sun. Their sweat mingled in the Dakota dust as they worked together, digging a small but vital irrigation ditch towards a patch of potentially arable land, rebuilding sections of fence damaged by wind, sharing the hard, physical work essential for mutual survival. Of course, merging two worlds so fundamentally different wasn't seamless. Friction arose born of misunderstanding and deeply ingrained habits. A poignant example occurred during the repair of the old horse barn, its timbers weathered and weak. Thomas's experienced ranch hand, Jed, accustomed to working against the clock, pushed his crew hard, aiming to finish before nightfall. The Lakota helpers, however, worked at a different pace. They examined each piece of replacement timber meticulously, tested the stability of each supporting post with careful deliberation, their movements unhurried, almost ritualistic. "Why are they moving like molasses in January?" Jed muttered impatiently to Thomas, wiping sweat from his brow as the sun dipped lower. "We'll be working by lantern light at this rate." The difference wasn't laziness, it was perspective. Jed focused on immediate completion. The Lakota focused on longevity, on ensuring the structure was sound not just for now, but would withstand the crushing weight of winter snows and the fury of prairie blizzards for years to come. Thomas, feeling the pressure of dwindling daylight himself, felt a surge of impatience. But Swift River, observing the tension, quietly intervened. He explained to Thomas, who then relayed it to Jed, "My people do not simply nail wood together. They listen to the wood, feel its strength. They consider the wind's path. They build so that the spirits of the place are respected, so that it stands strong for many seasons, not just one." The explanation, coupled with Elizabeth's gentle encouragement for mutual respect of methods, suggesting Jed focus on preparing materials while the Lakota focused on the structural integrity, eased the immediate friction. Jed grumbled, but conceded, and slowly, grudgingly, a new rhythm of work emerged, blending settler efficiency with Lakota thoroughness. They realized, perhaps, that sometimes the slow way, done with intention and respect for the materials and the elements, was ultimately the fastest way to achieve lasting results. And therein lies another lesson, doesn't it? Differences need not be insurmountable barriers. Often they represent opportunities to learn, to adapt, to find complementary strengths. When we cultivate the patience to listen, the humility to respect perspectives different from our own, we build not only stronger barns, but stronger bonds, stronger communities. But trust and understanding are like fragile seedlings, vulnerable to the harsh winds of malice. Marshall Crawford, festering in his Clearwater bank, received regular reports from disillusioned or indebted townsfolk about the growing cooperation at the Hayes place. He couldn't abide it. This unlikely alliance wasn't just an obstacle to his plans. It was an affront to his worldview, a dangerous example that threatened the established order of power and prejudice he thrived upon. He needed to shatter it, to poison the well of their nascent cooperation. And he knew precisely how to exploit the deep-seated fears and suspicions that still lingered beneath the surface. One moonless night, under the cloak of deepest darkness, Crawford's loyal, thuggish foreman, Samuel Blackwood, accompanied by 2 rough men hired quietly from outside Clearwater, executed their insidious orders. It wasn't a direct, noisy assault. It was quieter, more sinister. Fire. Flames erupted suddenly, violently in the eastern pasture, the area closest to the temporary Lakota encampment, consuming a precious section of carefully conserved dry grass, vital for winter fodder. The harsh clang of the ranch's alarm bell shattered the pre-dawn stillness. Sleep-fogged figures tumbled from the bunkhouse and the Lakota teepees simultaneously. Instinct took over. White ranch hands and Lakota warriors, momentarily forgetting suspicion, grabbed buckets, burlap sacks, anything at hand, and raced towards the inferno. They battled the wind-whipped flames side by side, a chaotic ballet of desperation against the terrifying orange glow that lit the sky. Working together with frantic urgency, they managed to beat back the blaze, containing it before it could consume the entire pasture or threaten the camp or ranch buildings. But the damage was done. More significant than the acres of scorched earth and lost winter feed was the insidious fire of suspicion instantly rekindled. Why had the fire started there, so close to the Lakota? Was it a careless campfire left untended? An accident? Or was it something else? The unspoken question hung heavy and acrid in the smoke-filled air, threatening to incinerate the fragile bridges they had so painstakingly begun to build. Crawford didn't need to show his face. He didn't need witnesses tracing the act back to him directly. One well-placed spark of sabotage, timed to exploit existing fault lines, was enough. He understood the insidious psychology of fear, the way ingrained prejudice could flare up at the slightest provocation, overriding reason and fledgling trust. He had sown the wind, and now hoped to reap the whirlwind of division. As the first grey light of dawn illuminated the blackened, smoking landscape, casting long, mournful shadows, Elizabeth and Swift River stood surveying the damage. They exchanged a look of grim understanding. This fight wasn't just against the elements or financial ruin anymore. They faced a cunning, ruthless human adversary willing to employ any tactic, however vile, to destroy the tentative peace they were forging. Their alliance, despite the strides made, was still terrifyingly young, vulnerable. The embers of the physical fire could be extinguished, but dousing the newly reignited flames of suspicion and hatred fanned by an unseen enemy would require a different kind of strength, a deeper level of trust than they had yet achieved, and perhaps for the first time they both felt a chilling premonition. Their own courage and cooperation might not be enough. Was there any higher authority, any arm of justice that could reach this volatile frontier, capable of protecting what was right against the insidious poison of calculated malice? The question lingered unanswered as they looked towards the smoke-stained horizon, where the sun was rising, but the future felt shrouded in shadow. The fire of suspicion, once ignited, smoulders stubbornly, difficult to extinguish completely. In the days following the pasture fire, a palpable tension settled over the Hayes Ranch, like a suffocating blanket. Though cooperation continued out of sheer necessity, the easy camaraderie that had begun to blossom withered under the harsh glare of unspoken questions. Who was truly responsible? While Elizabeth and Swift River privately harbored no doubts about Crawford's involvement, proving it was another matter. Among the ranch hands, and even within Thomas Hayes himself, the seed of doubt, cleverly planted, took root. Could it have been carelessness from their new neighbors, an accident masking resentment? Prejudice, that tenacious weed, only needed the smallest crack in the soil of trust to reassert itself, even in ground seemingly cultivated with good will. Thomas, trying to maintain a semblance of fairness dictated by his gratitude, nonetheless found his gaze lingering on the Lakota with renewed scrutiny. He became more watchful, his interactions tinged with a subtle reserve that hadn't been there before. Elizabeth saw it, felt it in the strained silences, the averted glances. Swift River, too, sensed the shift, the subtle rebuilding of invisible walls. They both knew with growing urgency that unless they could uncover concrete proof of Crawford's sabotage, this fragile alliance, their only shield against ruin, could fracture from within, achieving Crawford's goal without him lifting another finger directly. Adding fuel to the simmering unease, Samuel Blackwood and his hired roughs began to reappear, not lurking in shadows, but riding brazenly near the ranch boundaries. They did. Nothing overtly aggressive, just watched. Their insolent presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of Crawford's reach, his lingering power, designed to fray nerves and sow further discord. "Just checking on things, Hayes," Blackwood sneered with false solicitude when Thomas rode out to confront him, his hand hovering near the gun holstered on his hip. "Wouldn't want any more unfortunate accidents happening out here, especially with unreliable elements nearby." The insinuation was clear, poisonous, but then just as the tension seemed poised to snap, an entirely unexpected development occurred, shifting the dynamics dramatically. A different group of riders approached, not from the dusty trails leading back to the Lakota lands, but purposefully from the direction of Clearwater. They rode with an air of quiet authority. Leading them was a man whose face was unfamiliar to the Hayes family, older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a shock of salt and pepper hair beneath a respectable hat, his eyes sharp, assessing and carrying the weight of serious purpose. This was Judge Nathaniel Chambers, a traveling federal circuit judge, known for his integrity and his determination to bring a semblance of true law to the often lawless territories. Flanking him were 4 grim-faced men wearing the unmistakable star badges of U.S. Marshals, their presence radiating federal authority, a power that significantly overshadowed local influence, even Crawford's. Their arrival visibly stunned Blackwood and his companions, who had been lounging insolently near the ranch's main gate. Crawford might rule Clearwater with an iron fist, bullying local sheriffs and influencing town councils, but confronting a federal judge backed by U.S. Marshals was an entirely different proposition. Blackwood's sneer evaporated, replaced by apprehension. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Chambers' voice cut through the tense air, calm but resonant with authority that needed no shouting. "Is Sheriff Miller aware that you and your men are currently loitering, potentially intimidating residents on private property?" Blackwood stammered, suddenly bereft of his usual swagger. "I thought not," the judge continued coolly. "I suggest you and your associates vacate these premises immediately. Federal marshals are now overseeing the security of this ranch, pending investigation." After Blackwood and his unnerved men hastily withdrew, looking back with a mixture of resentment and fear, Judge Chambers turned his keen gaze towards Thomas, Elizabeth, and Swift River, who had come out to meet the unexpected arrivals. He introduced himself and his marshals, his demeanor serious but not unkind. He then revealed the purpose of his unannounced visit. He had been quietly, meticulously investigating Marshal Wilson Crawford's banking practices and questionable land acquisitions across the territory for months. Whispers of predatory lending, coerced foreclosures, and intimidation had reached his ears through confidential informants in various settlements. The grotesque auction of Elizabeth Hayes at the Clearwater Town Hall, reported anonymously but corroborated by a few brave souls willing to risk Crawford's wrath, had been the final catalyst, providing sufficient grounds for him to intervene. "Openly and decisively, what was perpetrated against you, Miss Hayes," Judge Chambers said, his voice softening with genuine sympathy as he addressed Elizabeth directly, "was not merely a personal indignity, though it was certainly that. It was a flagrant symptom of a deeper corruption, an abuse of power and systemic manipulation that I am determined to root out." He then confirmed what Swift River had surmised, lending official weight to the warrior's insights. Our preliminary findings strongly indicate, Mr. Hayes, that Crawford's primary motive in targeting your family was indeed the strategic control of the water source on your eastern parcel. We've uncovered evidence suggesting a pattern of similar water rights manipulation across 3 counties. Hearing the judge's words, seeing the tangible presence of federal law standing firm on their porch, felt like a dam breaking within Thomas and Elizabeth. A wave of profound relief washed over them, so potent it almost buckled Thomas's knees. Justice, which had seemed an abstract concept, impossibly distant on this harsh frontier, had finally, tangibly, extended its protective arm. The lingering, corrosive suspicions about Swift River's true motives, planted by Crawford and nurtured by ingrained prejudice, also began to dissipate, replaced by a growing respect for his foresight and integrity, now validated by an impartial, powerful authority. Here perhaps is a lesson in the slow, often unseen workings of justice. Faith in what is right can feel fragile, easily extinguished in the face of overwhelming power and corruption. Yet, even in the darkest, most lawless corners, individuals quietly strive to uphold the principles of fairness. And sometimes, one courageous act of witness, one timely report reaching the right ears, can be enough to set the ponderous wheels of law into motion, however slowly they may turn. However, the relief, though profound, was immediately tempered by a new, more complex shadow. After reassuring them that federal indictments against Crawford for bank fraud, conspiracy, and likely other charges were imminent, Judge Chambers delivered further, deeply troubling news. This wasn't about the local predator. This was a threat, emanating from the distant heart of power, Washington, D.C. "There's something else you must be aware of," he said, his expression growing grave, his gaze shifting pointedly towards Swift River. "News travels slowly out here, but word has reached me of new legislative drafts being debated in Congress, regulations aimed at further managing the native populations." He chose his words carefully. "If these laws pass as currently written, they could severely restrict the rights of native peoples, including those of mixed heritage," he added, acknowledging Swift River's unique status, "to travel freely, to engage in trade, and critically, to own or lease property outside designated reservation boundaries." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It could potentially render cooperative agreements like the one you seem to be forging here legally void, irrespective of any local contracts or even territorial court rulings." The whiplash was dizzying. They had just escaped the snapping jaws of the local wolf, only to find themselves standing in the shadow of a far larger, more impersonal beast, a federal bureaucracy thousands of miles away, capable of crushing their unique, hard-won partnership with the stroke of a pen. Crawford's threat, though terrifying, was tangible, personal. But how could they possibly fight laws enacted in distant chambers, driven by political expediency, broad-stroke prejudices, and forces utterly beyond their control or comprehension? The arm of the law had reached out to shield them from one villain. But would that same system, operating on a grander, more detached scale, ultimately prove strong enough or even willing to protect them from the chilling shadow of discriminatory policies descending from the very government meant to uphold justice? That question felt colder, more frightening than Crawford's personal vendetta, casting a pall over the very foundation of the alliance they had just begun to build with sweat, sacrifice, and a fragile, burgeoning trust. They say when one door closes, another opens. But sometimes that newly opened door reveals a corridor far longer, darker, and more labyrinthine than the one just escaped. The news of the impending federal regulations cast a heavy, ominous cloud over the fragile hope. rekindled at the Hayes Ranch. The victory over Crawford felt suddenly precarious, potentially Pyrrhic. How could a small rancher, his daughter and a Lakota warrior, stand against the tide of legislation flowing from Washington, a force as impersonal and powerful as the prairie wind? Marshal Crawford, though now under federal investigation and his direct movements likely restricted pending indictment, was far from defeated. Stripped of his ability to use overt intimidation, his cunning shifted towards manipulating the very legal system now closing in on him. Aware of the proposed federal laws through his own contacts, his strategy mutated. Delay. Bog down the Hayes family and Swift River in costly, time-consuming legal challenges at the territorial level. File motions, appeals, injunctions, anything. To stall, to bleed them dry, to keep their cooperative venture in legal limbo until the federal hammer fell, potentially nullifying their entire agreement automatically. It was amidst this atmosphere of looming legal battles and gnawing uncertainty that Swift River proposed another audacious, unexpected move. Not a plan involving defense or reaction, but a proactive measure rooted in a deep understanding of the white man's system, forming a legally incorporated entity under territorial law, the Hayes Lakota Cooperative Land and Cattle Company. A.T. Company, Thomas echoed, his brow furrowed in skepticism. Dusting off his old suit for court appearances was one thing, but incorporating. We're ranchers, Swift River, farmers, not businessmen with charters and bylaws. Precisely, Swift River replied, his dark eyes intense. But under the white man's law, a legally registered company is treated as a person. It possesses rights, the right to own property, to enter contracts, to conduct business. And crucially, he emphasized, it can be afforded certain legal protections and recognized standing that individuals, particularly Lakota individuals, his gaze held a flicker of weary experience, are often denied. If we establish ourselves as a legitimate, functioning corporate entity before these new federal restrictions are enacted, challenging our established rights becomes significantly more complex, legally speaking. It was a brilliant, counterintuitive strategy, using the tools of the very system that threatened them to build a shield against it. Elizabeth, with her quick mind for practicalities and her growing appreciation for Swift River's strategic thinking, immediately grasped the potential. Judge Chambers, when consulted via telegraph, expressed surprise, but after consideration, cautiously acknowledged the legal validity of the approach, offering to recommend a trustworthy lawyer in Bismarck, the territorial capital, to assist with the complex drafting process. However, transforming this clever idea into a tangible, legally sound reality proved a formidable challenge, a true test of the trust and understanding they had painstakingly begun to build. The process of drafting the company charter became a microcosm of the larger cultural negotiation. How could they reconcile the rigid structures and individualistic focus of white corporate law with the communal values, oral traditions, and holistic worldview of the Lakota? Elder Stonehand, a respected Lakota council member whose memory held the scars of countless broken treaties and empty promises sealed with white man's ink, was deeply skeptical. He voiced his concerns during a tense council meeting held near the creek, Swift River carefully translating. The Wasichu's paper writings, Stonehand stated, his weathered face etched with distrust, his voice low but firm, are too often snares, tools for deception. They trap the spirit in rigid lines. Our strength lies in the spoken word, sealed by honor, in the bonds of community felt in the heart, not in lifeless letters on a page that can be twisted by clever tongues. Conversely, Thomas Hayes, conditioned by a lifetime of needing clear boundaries and fearing financial ruin, craved precise definitions: rights, responsibilities, profit distribution, liability. He wanted everything explicitly documented, worrying about potential mismanagement or legal loopholes that could leave him vulnerable. Jed and the other ranch hands shared similar anxieties, concerned about wages and job security within this unfamiliar structure. It fell largely to Elizabeth and Swift River, acting as mediators and translators not just of language, but of deeply ingrained cultural perspectives to bridge this divide. Night after night, often working late by lantern light in the ranch house kitchen, they painstakingly reviewed draft clauses sent by the Bismarck lawyer. Elizabeth would explain complex legal jargon, shareholder rights, fiduciary duty, liability limitation, in practical, relatable terms to her father and the hands. Swift River, in turn, would patiently articulate Lakota principles of collective responsibility, consensus-based decision-making, and reverence for the land, ensuring these values were somehow reflected, or at least not violated, by the formal charter. They argued, compromised, and slowly, painstakingly crafted clauses, attempting to balance individual accountability with communal benefit, seeking ways to ensure both sides felt their rights, interests, and voices were genuinely represented and protected within the document, likely creating one of the most unique corporate charters in the history of the Dakota Territory. While this complex internal negotiation unfolded, the external enemy remained active. Samuel Blackwood, though laying low locally, surfaced again in Clearwater, but this time his companions weren't local thugs. He was seen escorting 3 unfamiliar men, sharply dressed individuals who arrived on the eastbound train from Chicago. They carried briefcases, took the best rooms at the Overland Hotel, and spoke with the clipped precision of city lawyers, yet their eyes held the cold, predatory assessment of professional investigators, or perhaps troubleshooters. They began making discreet inquiries around town, probing into the Hayes Ranch finances, Swift River's past activities as James Blackhawk, the specific terms of the land sale, every detail they could unearth about the fledgling cooperative agreement. A new, more sophisticated and potentially far more dangerous threat, backed by Crawford's remaining wealth and influence, had materialized. And then, the insidious seed of internal suspicion, seemingly dormant since the fire, was deliberately resown. A formal legal challenge arrived from Bismarck, filed by lawyers representing Crawford's interests. It contested not the entire cooperative concept, but one very specific, nuanced clause within the draft charter regarding water usage allocation. During extreme drought conditions, a detail that had been debated intensely, internally, during one of the late-night sessions attended only by Thomas, Elizabeth, Swift River, Jed, and 2 trusted Lakota elders. How could Crawford's lawyers possibly know the exact wording and sticking points of that confidential discussion? The implication was chillingly clear. Someone present in those private, trust-based meetings must have leaked the information. Was it one of the Lakota elders, perhaps harboring resentment or swayed by an unknown pressure? Was it Jed, tempted by Crawford's money, or holding on to old prejudices? Or unthinkable, was it someone even closer? The suspicion spread like an oil slick, cold, pervasive, and deeply unnerving. It didn't need to be spoken aloud. It manifested in wary glances exchanged across the supper table, in sudden, uncomfortable silences falling during previously open conversations, in a subtle tightening of guards. Who was the snake in their midst? Who could be fully trusted when the stakes were this high? The question hung, unspoken, poisoning the fragile atmosphere of cooperation they had fought so hard to create. What lesson resides here? Perhaps that in any struggle, the most formidable adversary isn't always the one standing openly before you. Internal doubt, corrosive suspicion, the fear of betrayal from within, these can be the most destructive weapons, capable of dismantling alliances far more effectively than external force. Building trust across divides is an arduous, fragile process. Preserving it against calculated campaigns of division and paranoia is infinitely harder. Amidst this maelstrom of legal maneuvering, external threats and internal anxieties, the rare moments of quiet connection between Elizabeth and Swift River became anchors in the storm. They seldom spoke directly of the fear or the suspicions swirling around them. The topic felt too dangerous, too potentially damaging. Yet in a shared glance across a crowded room, a brief, reassuring touch of hands while reviewing documents, a mutual sigh of exhaustion under the late-night lamp, they found a silent resonance, a strengthening of the unlikely bond forged between two souls from disparate worlds. This unspoken affection, blossoming against all odds in the heart of adversity, became a vital source of resilience for them both, a quiet reminder of what they were fighting for beyond just land and legality. And then, another crucial piece of news arrived, delivered by a weary rider from the territorial capital. Territorial Governor William Atkinson himself intended to visit the Hayes Ranch the following week. He was on a tour of the region, and intrigued by the reports from Judge Chambers and the sheer novelty of the Hayes Lakota cooperative filing, wanted to see this controversial experiment firsthand. This was it, a golden opportunity, a chance to present their unique model directly to the highest authority in the territory, to demonstrate its viability, its potential benefits, and perhaps gain crucial political leverage against both Crawford's legal challenges and the looming federal regulations. But the timing was perilous. With Crawford's Chicago lawyers sniffing around for any sign of weakness, with the ghost of internal betrayal haunting their discussions, and with the ever-present risk of another sabotage attempt designed specifically to embarrass them before the governor, the visit felt less like an opportunity and more like an incredibly high-stakes gamble. Could they hold everything together, present a united, successful front? Or would this be the moment their enemies chose to strike a decisive, perhaps fatal blow? In the high-stakes arenas of politics and survival, as on the battlefield, timing and perception are paramount. Territorial Governor William Atkinson's impending visit wasn't just a courtesy call, it was a potential turning point, a stage upon which the very future of the Hayes Lakota Cooperative could be affirmed or condemned. The news sent ripples of both hope and intense pressure through the fragile community. All eyes in Clearwater, both those wishing them well and those praying for their failure, would be fixed on the small, isolated ranch attempting something extraordinary, something potentially revolutionary for the territory. The weight of expectation was immense. In the days leading up to the visit, a flurry of activity consumed the ranch. Everyone worked with a shared sense of urgent purpose, the recent internal suspicions temporarily pushed aside by the need to present a unified, successful front. The newly constructed communal meeting hall, a modest structure built with combined labor, was scrubbed clean and decorated simply but respectfully with both settler-made quilts and Lakota beadwork. The Lakota camp near the creek was organized and tidy, children instructed to be on their best behavior. Cooperative activities, shared herding, ongoing work on the irrigation ditch, joint mending of tools, were planned to appear natural, functional, demonstrating the reality of their partnership. They needed the governor to see the truth. This wasn't some chaotic, idealistic experiment doomed to fail, but a pragmatic, functioning community creating tangible value and fostering peaceful coexistence. And then he arrived. A carriage bearing the territorial seal rolled into the dusty ranch yard, escorted by several armed outriders. Governor Atkinson, arguably the most powerful man between the Mississippi and the Rockies, stepped out. He was a man accustomed to command, his demeanor shrewd and observant. He shook Thomas Hayes's offered hand firmly, nodded politely but formally to Elizabeth and Swift River, his keen eyes sweeping across the scene, taking in the weathered ranch buildings, the watchful ranch hands, the curious Lakota families observing respectfully from a slight distance. He didn't hide his skepticism, but neither did he display overt prejudice. He was here to see for himself. The carefully planned tour began. Thomas explained the history of the ranch, the devastating impact of the drought. Swift River detailed the Lakota's perspective, their need for resources and passage, the logic behind the land purchase. Elizabeth spoke eloquently about the practicalities of the cooperative agreement, the shared labor, the nascent successes in resource management. Governor Atkinson listened intently, asking direct, pointed questions. Not hostile questions designed to trap them, but probing inquiries aimed at understanding the core mechanics. How exactly was the water shared during peak dry spells? What mechanisms were in place for resolving inevitable disputes between members of different cultures? Had cattle health or productivity genuinely improved since the cooperation began? What was the long-term vision for this partnership beyond immediate survival? Thomas, Elizabeth, and Swift River answered candidly, taking turns presenting a united front. They spoke with clarity, backed by specific examples. The successful joint repair of the barn, the improved condition of a small section of herd grazed on diversified forage identified by the Lakota, the shared management of the irrigation ditch. They didn't attempt to sugarcoat the reality, acknowledging the challenges, the cultural differences, the lingering distrust they were actively working to overcome. But they relentlessly emphasized the tangible achievements, the mutual benefits realized, and the immense potential this model held for reducing conflict and fostering economic stability in a territory plagued by friction between settlers and native tribes. Gradually, perceptibly, the initial skepticism etched on the governor's face seemed to soften, replaced by thoughtful consideration, perhaps even a flicker of genuine impressiveness. He was above all a practical man, responsible for the governance and development of a vast, volatile territory. What he was witnessing wasn't empty rhetoric or naive idealism. It was a working model, however small-scale, addressing the most vexing and costly problem he faced, the relationship between white settlers and the original inhabitants of the land. Could it be, he visibly pondered, that this unlikely alliance held a key, a potential blueprint for a more peaceful, prosperous future? But just as a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl, disaster, meticulously orchestrated, struck. It wasn't a dramatic fire this time, nor an overt brawl. It was subtler, designed to look accidental, yet calculated to prey on the deepest fears and prejudices associated with the wildness of the frontier. A small herd of cattle, grazing peacefully, in a nearby pasture under the watch of a young Lakota boy, suddenly spooked violently. Lowing in terror, their eyes wide with panic, they stampeded, not randomly but charging directly towards the governor's assembled party near the meeting hall. Chaos erupted. Shouts of alarm, the panicked whinnying of horses. The governor's escorts reacted instantly, drawing their weapons, forming a protective cordon around Atkinson. In the ensuing confusion, from the direction of the ridge overlooking the Lakota camp, a single gunshot cracked sharply through the air. Was it a careless hunter, a stray shot, or something far more deliberate, fired precisely to trigger the stampede and sow maximum chaos and fear? For a terrifying moment, pandemonium reigned. The scene unfolded exactly as Crawford's unseen agents must have intended, reinforcing the stereotype of inherent danger, of unpredictable savagery, the ever-present threat lurking just beneath the surface when the two worlds intersected too closely. This was the calculated blow, timed perfectly to sabotage the governor's positive impression at its most crucial juncture. Yet, in that maelstrom of panic, true character and the reality of the alliance shone through. Swift River, reacting with the lightning reflexes of a warrior and the innate understanding of animal behavior, passed down through generations, moved first. He didn't draw a weapon. Instead, he uttered a series of sharp, commanding calls in Lakota, coupled with precise, calming hand gestures, ancient techniques for managing panicked herds. Simultaneously, he moved decisively, positioning himself to skillfully divert the lead animals away from the terrified group. Several other young Lakota men, instantly understanding his actions, mirrored his movements, coordinating with remarkable discipline and courage, effectively turning the stampede away from the vulnerable gathering. At the same moment, Elizabeth displayed astonishing composure amidst the panic. While ensuring the governor and other guests were moved quickly towards the relative safety of the sturdy meeting hall wall, she simultaneously called out clear instructions, preventing further panic among the onlookers, her voice cutting through the noise. Her eyes, however, showed more than just concern. They held a spark of cold, sharp suspicion, darting towards the distant ridge from where the shot had likely originated. She knew, with chilling certainty, this was no accident. Within minutes, that felt like an eternity, the immediate danger passed. Order was gradually restored. The cattle were skillfully driven off into a far pasture by the Lakota herdsmen. Miraculously, no one was seriously harmed, though nerves were severely frayed. But the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. Governor Atkinson stood, dusting off his coat, visibly shaken but composed. His expression, however, was now deeply complex, inscrutable. He had just witnessed firsthand the impressive competence, courage, and effective cooperation between the Hayes family's people and the Lakota partners in a genuine crisis. He had seen their alliance function under extreme pressure, but he had also been starkly confronted with the potential volatility, the inherent dangers, real or manufactured, that this unprecedented proximity represented. The single gunshot, whether accidental or deliberate, underscored the fragility of peace on the frontier. Here lies a potent lesson. Crisis doesn't build character, it reveals it. An external attack, however malicious and well-planned, can sometimes inadvertently expose the underlying strength, cohesion, and resilience of a community. Elizabeth and Swift River, along with their people, had demonstrated that. But the incident also starkly illustrated how easily positive impressions, however well-earned, can be undermined by fear, especially when tapping into deep-seated prejudices. A single moment of chaos can overshadow hours of reasoned presentation. The remainder of the governor's visit felt strained, shadowed by the near disaster. He concluded his tour earlier than initially planned. He thanked Thomas, Elizabeth, and Swift River courteously for their hospitality and commended their bold efforts. But he offered no firm commitment, no explicit promise of support in their looming legal battles or against the federal regulations. He stated simply that he had much to consider, needing time to weigh the potential benefits of their innovative model against the undeniable political risks and the demonstrated potential for instability, however orchestrated it might have been. Elizabeth, Thomas, and Swift River watched the governor's carriage rattle away, disappearing into the vastness of the prairie, their hearts heavy with uncertainty. They had navigated the immediate crisis admirably, proving their partnership's effectiveness under fire. But they knew Crawford's calculated strike had partially succeeded. The governor's positive impression was now undeniably tainted with caution, perhaps even doubt. Their hopes for powerful political intervention dwindled. Their future now seemed to rest more squarely than ever on the scales of justice within a territorial courtroom, a place where they could only pray that truth, evidence, and the fundamental rightness of their cause would prevail over conspiracy, prejudice, and the long shadow of powerful enemies. Justice on the frontier, as perhaps everywhere, can resemble a seed sown in frozen earth. It lies dormant beneath layers of snow and indifference, making one question if it still holds life, if the warmth of spring, the thaw of fairness will ever truly arrive. Following Governor Atkinson's eventful, ambiguous visit, the Hayes Ranch and the associated Lakota community entered a protracted, nerve-wracking period of waiting. The crucial hearing before the Territorial Supreme Court regarding the legality and charter of the Hayes Lakota Cooperative Land and Cattle Company had taken place weeks prior in the distant capital, Bismarck. Arguments had been presented, evidence submitted. Crawford's lawyers had deployed their arsenal of objections and technicalities. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the verdict, a ruling that held the power to validate or utterly destroy everything they had sacrificed and struggled to build. That winter descended upon the Dakotas with particular ferocity. Blizzards raged across the plains, burying trails under deep drifts, severing communication lines, isolating communities for days, sometimes weeks at a time. The silence of the snow-blanketed landscape seemed to amplify the gnawing anxiety. Each passing day deepened the uncertainty. Had their efforts been in vain? Would the carefully crafted charter, their unique bridge between two worlds, be dismissed as illegitimate? Would the persuasive, well-funded arguments of Crawford's legal team, playing on prejudice and fear, ultimately outweigh the principles of fairness and the evidence of their functioning partnership? Doubts gnawed at Thomas. Even Elizabeth felt moments of profound weariness, the weight of relentless struggle pressing down. Only Swift River seemed to maintain his stoic patience, counseling watchful waiting, drawing strength from the resilience. His people had honed over generations of hardship. Then, one late winter afternoon, as the relentless grip of the cold finally began to show the faintest signs of easing, a lone mail carrier, his face chapped raw by windburn, finally battled his way through the melting drifts to the Hayes Ranch. He carried a precious, weather-beaten satchel containing mail delayed by the storms, including a single official-looking telegram addressed to Elizabeth Hayes from Bismarck. The entire ranch seemed to collectively hold its breath. Ranch hands paused their work. Lakota families emerged quietly from their lodges. All eyes were fixed on Elizabeth as she accepted the small, flimsy envelope that contained their collective fate. Her hands trembled almost uncontrollably as she tore it open, her eyes scanning the brief coded message within, her heart pounding against her ribs. A moment of stunned silence. Then a choked sob escaped her, quickly followed by a disbelieving whisper. We won." Her voice cracked, then rose, filled with an almost unbearable surge of joyous relief. "The court, they upheld the charter. They ruled in our favor. The company is legal." The tension that had held the ranch captive for months snapped like a taut wire. Cheers erupted, raw and unrestrained, echoing across the thawing prairie. White. Ranch hands slapped each other on the back, whooping with relief. Lakota men and women broke into smiles, murmuring words of thanks to Wakantanka. People who had labored side by side, faced danger together, navigated suspicion and misunderstanding, now spontaneously embraced, laughing through tears of sheer, unadulterated relief. The invisible walls, momentarily rebuilt by suspicion, crumbled completely in the shared flood of victory. Justice, though long delayed and hard fought, had not remained buried beneath the winter snows. Later, a more detailed letter accompanying the official ruling provided further cause for celebration. The Territorial Supreme Court, in a decisive 4-1 majority opinion, had not only affirmed the legality of the Hayes Lakota Cooperative Company under existing territorial law, but had specifically dismissed Crawford's challenges regarding Swift River's land ownership, under the recognized legal name James Blackhawk, and the right of Lakota members to participate fully in the company's operations and benefits. The Chief Justice, in his concluding remarks, had penned surprisingly strong words, stating that the court would not allow outdated prejudices and manipulative legal tactics to hinder innovative enterprises that demonstrate potential for mutual benefit and the common good of the territory. It became subtly clear that Governor Atkinson, though cautious publicly, had likely provided a quiet but influential amicus brief supporting the cooperative's legitimacy, swayed perhaps by what he had witnessed, despite the sabotage, as if the heavens themselves were finally smiling upon them. More good news arrived shortly thereafter, this time trickling down from Washington, D.C. via official channels facilitated by Judge Chambers and Governor Atkinson. Influenced by the positive reports on the functioning Hayes-Lakota model, presented as a potential blueprint for peaceful economic integration, and likely pressured by Atkinson's pragmatic arguments about reducing costly conflicts, the federal government had agreed to amend the controversial new legislation. A crucial exemption clause was added. Legally established cooperative enterprises involving Native Americans, which could demonstrate economic viability and adherence to territorial law prior to the Act's final passage, would be shielded from the harshest restrictions on trade and property rights outside reservation boundaries. It was a stunning double victory, a precious affirmation of their struggle at both the territorial and federal levels, secured by their resilience, strategic foresight, and the undeniable evidence of their successful cooperation. Here, perhaps, is the culmination of earlier lessons. The persistent struggle for what is right, conducted with courage, intelligence, and unwavering determination, can eventually yield results, however arduous the path. And sometimes creating a tangible working model, a living example that defies prejudice and demonstrates practical success, proves far more persuasive to those in power than mere rhetoric or protest alone. And the fate of the architect, of so much suffering. News soon spread from Clearwater like wildfire. Marshal Wilson Crawford, stripped of his political immunity and facing irrefutable evidence compiled by Judge Chambers' investigation, evidence of systemic bank fraud, water rights manipulation, conspiracy to unlawfully seize property, witness, intimidation, and potentially even charges related to the suspicious death of his first wife, was formally indicted on multiple federal counts. His power, built on a foundation of greed and injustice, crumbled spectacularly. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to a lengthy term in a distant federal penitentiary, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in the territory. Samuel Blackwood and several other key cronies also faced justice, receiving sentences commensurate with their roles in Crawford's schemes. Justice, though often slow-footed on the frontier, had finally arrived with decisive force. So, Crawford's long shadow finally receded. The most significant legal and political hurdles were overcome. The brutal winter relinquished its grip, yielding to the palpable warmth and burgeoning life of spring sweeping across the Dakota prairie. At the Hayes Ranch, now officially the Hayes-Lakota Cooperative Land and Cattle Company, a new chapter truly began, no longer defined by desperate struggle for mere survival, but by the shared opportunity to build, to grow, to heal, and to transform, an unlikely alliance forged in crisis into a strong, prosperous, and enduring community. But this victory wasn't merely the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of a different, perhaps more profound journey. A journey to prove that their cooperative model wasn't just legally sound, but socially, culturally, and emotionally sustainable in the long run. Could they maintain the unity and mutual respect fostered by facing a common enemy, now that the enemy was vanquished? Could the deep, unspoken feelings that had grown between Elizabeth and Swift River find their rightful place? openly acknowledged, within the complex tapestry of the multicultural community they had fought so hard to create. Spring had arrived, bursting with hope and new life, but it also brought with it new questions, new challenges, and the quiet unfolding of a future yet unwritten. Victory, however hard-won and profoundly relieving, is but a single milestone on the continuum of life. What truly defines the character and resilience of a community isn't merely how it weathers the storm, but how it chooses to live, to build, and to thrive together once the skies have cleared. That spring, the air at the Hayes Lakota Cooperative wasn't just buzzing with the lingering elation of their legal victories. It was vibrant with the purposeful energy of constructing a shared future, a future they now felt they had earned the right to shape. Having faced the external enemy, Crawford's greed, systemic prejudice, the indifference of nature, together they now confronted the quieter, perhaps more intricate challenge, nurturing the internal bonds, cultivating enduring trust, and transforming the alliance documented on paper into a living, breathing reality of daily harmony and sustainable coexistence. Without the unifying threat of Crawford looming over them, their cohesion had to find a new anchor, rooted firmly in mutual respect, shared benefit, and the conscious choice to continue building bridges every single day. To mark this transition, this deliberate shift from survival to thriving, and to solidify their bond in a manner that resonated more deeply than legal statutes, the Lakota elders, after council with Swift River, proposed holding a traditional ceremony. Not within the confines of their camp, but significantly within the shared space of the communal meeting hall, the very structure built by combined hands. It wasn't intended as a conversion or an imposition of belief, but as an offering, a ceremony of gratitude, wapila, to the Creator for their deliverance, a ritual to honor the land, maka, that sustained them all, and crucially, a symbolic act, to formally recognize and bless the joining of their two peoples, acknowledging their intertwined destinies. Thomas Hayes, initially hesitant, was persuaded by Elizabeth's gentle insistence and his own dawning recognition that true partnership required understanding and respecting different forms of solemnity. He, Elizabeth, Jed, and the other ranch hands attended not as curious onlookers, but as invited, respected participants. They stood respectfully, listening to the ancient, resonant chants, feeling the palpable sacredness in the air, thick with the pungent, cleansing smoke of burning sage. They witnessed symbolic rituals, the sharing of the pipe signifying unity and truthfulness, the offering of tobacco to the four directions acknowledging connection to all creation, representing harmony, shared responsibility, and a collective commitment to protect the land they now jointly depended upon. That ceremony, conducted with dignity and profound meaning in the Lakota way, forged an invisible yet powerful connection, an acknowledgement of kinship that transcended bloodlines, skin color, or origin stories. It was a spiritual ratification of their legal charter. As the ceremony concluded, Swift River quietly explained to Elizabeth and a deeply moved Thomas that in his culture, such rituals not only reinforced community bonds, but also acknowledged and honored deep, perhaps fated, connections between individuals, destinies meant to intertwine. His dark eyes sought Elizabeth's as he spoke these words, a quiet confession veiled in cultural explanation, yet profoundly personal, a truth that now felt safe enough to approach the light. And it was within this atmosphere of newfound peace, burgeoning prosperity, the spring rains had finally tentatively returned, and deepening mutual respect, that the love story which had quietly, persistently bloomed like a resilient prairie rose amidst thorns of adversity, finally found the space and courage to be spoken aloud. Free from the constant pressure of imminent legal threats, financial ruin, or physical danger, Elizabeth and Swift River could at last turn fully towards the undeniable truth residing in their own hearts. One evening, as twilight painted the vast Dakota sky in soft hues of lavender and rose, they stood together near the creek, the gentle murmur of the water a soothing counterpoint to the chirping crickets. "You once told me," Elizabeth began softly, her voice barely disturbing the stillness, her gaze meeting his directly, openly, "that you often felt caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither." She paused, looking around at the peaceful coexistence, the ranch house lights twinkling in the distance, the soft glow of campfires near the creek. "Here, Swift River, it feels as though together we've managed to create a small space where both those worlds can not only meet, but live, side by side." Swift River stopped, turning to face her fully. The usual stoic reserve in his deep eyes softened, replaced by a rare, undisguised warmth that made her heart quicken. "Yes," he replied, his voice low, resonant. "We have built a place. But a place," he continued, holding her gaze, "only truly becomes home when there is one heart to share it with. I have walked a long, often lonely journey, Elizabeth, searching for a path where my spirit could find rest, where I could truly belong, and I have come to understand that path would remain incomplete, unfinished if you were not walking it beside me." There were no flowery declarations, no grand, sweeping promises of eternal ease. Just the simple, profound sincerity of a man who had navigated immense complexity and danger, finding not only his place in the world, but the companion his soul recognized. A quiet strength flowed between them, an understanding forged in shared trials and silent observation. Elizabeth smiled, not just with her lips, but with her eyes, a radiant, peaceful smile that illuminated her face in the fading light. A sense of rightness, of arrival, settled over her. "Then," she replied, her voice filled with quiet certainty and unwavering conviction, "we will walk this journey together, Tashunka Wakinyan. And perhaps the final, most enduring lesson is this: the greatest, most meaningful journey isn't always about overcoming the external mountains of hardship, but about navigating the internal landscapes to find harmony. Harmony between disparate cultures, harmony between individuals, and ultimately, harmony between the cautious whispers of the head and the undeniable truth of the heart. When we find the courage to step across the boundaries erected by fear, prejudice, or history, we can discover connections more profound, futures more rich and meaningful than we ever dared to imagine. And so, upon the vast, enduring canvas of the Dakota Plains, land that had drunk the bitter tears of conflict, despair, and injustice, a new story was being written, a story etched not in dominance or defeat, but in the ink of courage manifested in the face of overwhelming odds, the transformative power of unlikely cooperation, and the quiet miracle of healing wounds once thought too deep, too permanent. The Hayes Lakota Cooperative Land and Cattle Company became more than just a successful legal entity, a model studied by territorial officials. It became a living testament, a breathing symbol that two paths, seemingly destined to run parallel in suspicion and fear, could indeed converge, forging a single shared journey, stronger, richer, and ultimately more hopeful for having joined together. The future stretching before them undoubtedly held challenges. Old prejudices like stubborn weeds wouldn't vanish overnight. Cultural differences would continue to require daily doses of patience, communication, and mutual respect. The vast indifference of nature would still test their resilience. But now they faced those challenges not in isolation, but as a community, bound by shared experience, mutual reliance, and an unwavering faith in the possibility of a better tomorrow built together. The story had begun with the degradation of a humiliating auction block, a moment where human dignity was treated as a mere commodity. But it didn't end there. It ended instead under the vast, watchful Dakota sky, with an image of quiet hope, burgeoning harmony, and the enduring power of human connection. Two peoples, finding a common path, embarking on a meaningful journey, proving that even in the most arid soil, nurtured by courage, understanding, and love, life in its most beautiful forms can take root and blossom.